in Egypt, leads them out of Egypt and forms a kingdom of priests and a people for his own glory. Now, I want to sort of cover the book of Moses in the book of Exodus in three sort of movements. And I'm borrowing this from the Bible Project as a way of sort of keep a 30,000-foot view of the book of Exodus. First is from Exodus 1 through 14 is the movement of Israel's enslavement and their deliverance. And then the second movement is Israel's journey from Egypt to Mount Sinai. And that's covered in Exodus 15 through 19. And lastly, Israel's covenant, the law, and the tabernacle. We'll cover that then in Exodus 20 through 40. So I don't know how long this is going to take. I remember my first sermon on the book of James, I preached on the first half of verse 1. Someone afterwards came up to me and was like, so that was like verse 1a, is next Sunday going to be verse 1b? And we made it through that in about I think it was a little over a year. But we're in no rush. I think there's a lot of stuff in here for us that we can learn that we can learn about who God is and our walk and our story in that, or part of that story. So what questions should we ask? 4 questions I think that we should ask as we sort of move through this, because there's so many layers to these Old Testament narratives of God's people. First one is theological. What does this story teach us about God and the world? Secondly, Christological. How does this story point us forward to Jesus? Thirdly, is thematic. What biblical themes are reflected in this story? And I think we'll find that there's these biblical themes run through this story, and there's some really profound concepts and themes in the story of Exodus. And fourthly, practical. What are the practical lessons that we can learn from the story? The reality is that the people we're going to learn about are people like you and me. They're people with the same tendencies, the same temptations, the same passions and longings and desires and hopes. They're people like you and I. And I think that's the beauty of this story, that God makes a people for himself out of them. So before we actually dig into the text of Exodus 1, I want to look at a little bit of background context. And this story really begins in Genesis. And it feels like the feeling that you get sometimes if you happen to jump into a movie that's already started and it's like a fourth of the way done, or you pick up a book and you start reading the story like 5 chapters in. It doesn't. In order for you to make sense of the story, you have to understand what came before, what started, how it started, and that's the story of the Exodus starts in Genesis really, and the last part of Genesis, especially with Joseph and how God redeems the really the tragic story of Joseph and his slavery in Egypt, and how he's risen to power, the second most powerful man in Egypt. And God uses him to be a blessing for his family. Ultimately, his father and his brothers and their families move to Egypt and settle down in Egypt. The opening verse, the first verse of Exodus says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household." And this verse is almost a direct quote of Genesis chapter, I think it's 49, where he lists the same names. And I think that's just a clue or a hint as to this link with Exodus and Genesis. So Genesis 50, it ends with the death of Joseph. Joseph remained in Egypt, his father's house. He lived until he was 110 years old, and then he passes away, moves on, and his family continues to live in Egypt. So we're going to go ahead and read verses 1. Well, all of chapter 1. That's what we're covering today. Exodus chapter 1. I'm going to be reading in the ESV. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you serve as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live." But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this, and let the male children live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." Amen. Quite the opening to this book. There's a lot that happens here. And we start off with Jacob's family prospering in Egypt. Genesis 10 ends, they settle down, and in chapter 46 of Genesis, Pharaoh invites Jacob's family to settle down in Egypt. And he says, "Come settle in the best part of Egypt, in the most fertile land of Egypt." And that was the land of Goshen, which they believe was part of the Nile Delta. And I guess when you think of Egypt today, I'm just curious what you think of, like what's what it looks like, the geography. What's the first picture that pops into your mind when you think of Egypt? Anyone? Sorry, I heard just a dull roar. What's that? Pyramids and camels. Okay. Anybody else? Desert, sand. Okay. Yeah, like hot pyramids, desert, sand. So I wanted to look at pictures of Egypt and where Jacob's family would have settled down. And I just did a little Google map search here of this. This is just a random town or city along the Nile. But you can really see the contrast here of what the land around the Nile River looked like versus the desert and the wilderness that was out beyond that. And what would happen is that every year during the rainy season, and it still happens today, where the Nile would flood up to I've heard up to 20 miles away from the riverbanks, and that flooding caused this green growth to basically made it one of the most fertile farmlands of the world. I think it was Marty Solomon with the Bema podcast says that, according to a report that was done a couple years ago, I think it was the Nile Delta is the second most fertile farm soil in the world, actually. You zoom out a little bit further, and that's what you get. It's just like this dark green lush surrounded by wilderness, desert, hot, what we think of as Egypt. This is even further out, and all the way up to the top left there, you see sort of a big green area. That's the Nile River Delta, where a bunch of rivers converge. And according to a couple different sources, Goshen would have been in the right hand corner of this green area. So they were given the most fertile land. They were prospering, and as a result of this, we see a couple clues that point us back to Genesis, some echoes of the Genesis story. And first of all, the creation mandate. We see a fulfillment or a working out of that. Verse 7 of Exodus says, "But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them." And that's almost a direct paraphrasing or wording of the command, the first command that God gives Adam after he creates Adam and Eve. He says, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, have dominion over every living thing and every creature." We see this working out here. Like, life was going really good for Jacob's family at this time. We see a past promise of that God had given to Abraham fulfilled here. He had told Abraham in Genesis 17. Actually, just turn to that if you don't mind. Genesis 17, verses 1 through 6. God promises that Abraham will have many children. And I'm not going to read all of this, but down through this, some paraphrasing, he says things like, "Multiply you greatly. You shall be a father of a multitude of nations. I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations." So jumping back to Exodus, we see that promise that God is making starting to be fulfilled. It says, "The people of Israel and the land was filled with them. They increased and multiplied greatly." So an interesting fulfillment of God's promises there. So some of that farmland, this is what that looks like. You see the pyramids in the back there, but then you see this green, lush fields of, I don't know what all is growing there, but just dark green, lush, beautiful farmland. Almost looks like Myron's fields in Walnut Creek, Ohio, but just another picture there. Just beautiful, beautiful fields. So keep this good life in mind as we continue on in the story of Exodus. And when the people of Israel, when they go out into the wilderness and they start complaining about hunger and all these different things, this is what they have in mind. This is what they've left. This is what they're going to have in mind, the good life back in Egypt. All right, so moving on here in verse 8, here is where things sort of take a nosedive. And if you picture a graph, just a line graph, it's like life is pretty good. It's like this graph is like maybe right up here, and verse 8 comes and it's just like it starts to nosedive. And by the time we're done with chapter 1, we're going to be at the bottom of that chart. "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them.'" That word shrewdly, I guess I heard this thought from Tim Mackey with the Bible Project. He says that this is almost an echo of the snake in the garden that comes into the garden that was where there was shalom and peace, and the snake enters the picture to cause chaos and to ruin God's creation. We see the same thing happening here, and a picture of Pharaoh as the snake who enters the picture. "Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities." The Pharaoh's role in Egypt, and this was, I heard this idea from Ray Vanderlaan, was the Pharaoh's role was to maintain order and to maintain the cosmic order. And every day, it was his responsibility to perform to be part of the rituals, to make sure the rituals in the places of worship would happen. And as long as those were happening, the sun would rise and set every day. And it was his responsibility ultimately to make sure that happens, that order in the universe and in the land was kept. And anything that threatened to come in the way of that was not okay. Anything that came in the way of Pharaoh maintaining order in the land was subjected to his tyranny. So we see the story go from this to this right here. These are just some fascinating images found in Egypt today. And this is an almost universal picture in many different ways of the might of Pharaoh. And you can't see the stick there, but he's holding a stick. And it's a symbol of his power, of his might, and his responsibility to maintain order in the world. We see the Hebrew people, Jacob's sons and his family, go from the good life to the tyranny of this new Pharaoh that rises to power. So we see in verses 11 on, they set taskmasters over them. We see this escalation of oppression that happens in the children of Israel. They start off by being enslaved. And in Pharaoh's mind, and it even makes sense to us, I think, today, or the very practical problems of trying to have a nation where there is order. You think of the problems that come with a huge increase in population. Deans, you just came back from Greece. That's a huge problem there in the chaos that can happen when a huge population comes in. We see that happening with Pharaoh, and you can see the fear that brought up to him, the fear that he thought of when the children of Israel increased in number, and this caused a lot of fear for him. And I think he took that fear and he used it to justify the oppression that he caused on them. He had this fear that the children of Israel would grow so strong that they would basically take over, or that they would leave and flee Egypt and join another power. So, as a result of this, they basically took an asset, people that were an asset to their nation, and that asset all of a sudden became a threat to his power and to the order of the nation. And with the slavery, subjecting them to slavery, he had free labor, and he was able to continue doing his thing and growing strong while subjecting Israel to, or the children of Israel to slavery. Verse 13 of 14, I think, really brings this to focus. And you see a repeat of wording here. So, actually in verse 12, it says, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread. You see this, like, Moses having this idea that if I just subject them to slavery, that will take care of my immigration problem. That will take care of my population problem. They won't have time to have bigger families. They won't have time to have more children, to raise families. So I'm going to get free labor, and my population problem will take care of itself. But God, in his sense of humor, I think I don't know if there was, I'd like to think there was a miracle behind this, and that God allowed them to keep growing. It says the more they were oppressed, the faster they grew, the more they increased. And so it became this vicious cycle that more oppression caused even more increase in number. And it comes to the point where the Egyptians are working them ruthlessly. Verse 13 says, ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. And then it repeats that same wording again. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So it's like this all-out slave labor, basically. And when that doesn't work, you see the Pharaoh increase or escalate the oppression of God's people. It goes from slavery to, he transitions to murder. Moving on in verse 16, he tells the Hebrew midwives, he says, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So he goes from slavery to now, okay, I can't keep up with the population problem. I'm going to subject them to murder. I'm going to take care of the population problem myself. And he starts to command I would say, the private killing of these baby boys. And I think there's a beautiful, I guess, lesson here with these midwives, that there are times when God calls you and I to stand up and get in the way of evil. And you see these two midwives do that in this story. They basically said they feared God, and they said, no, we're not going to go along with this. And the picture that I get is this is a famous picture. Most of you have probably seen it in Germany, where this whole group of men are saluting Heil Hitler, except this one guy in the circle right here. He's got his both arms crossed like that. And that's sort of almost the idea that I get behind these two midwives that say, no, we're not going along with this. We're standing up to evil. We're not going to go along with the work of Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh says, fine, if you're not going to do that, all the way in the end of the chapter 1, because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. You see God blessing them for getting in the way of evil and standing up to the power of Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So he couldn't get his midwives to kill these young boys, these Hebrew boys. So he issues an all-out public, I would say, genocide of these Hebrew baby boys. He says, then Pharaoh commanded all his people. It's no longer just the midwives, it was all the Egyptian people. Take these baby boys, throw them into the Nile. I think there was just a picture or a picture of Satan's hatred for life and for God's plans here. In his book on Exodus, Philip Ryken says, wherever there is a reign of terror or a culture of death, Satan is trying to destroy the work of God. The slogans change, but the sin remains the same. Whether it is Adolf Hitler and his final solution for eliminating the Jews, or communist China and its one child, one family policy, or the pro-choice movement in the West, opposition to life is always hatred of God. The idea, I think, the main idea that I want us to get from this text and this opening story of Exodus is this idea of Pharaoh, the tyrant, and being such a clear parallel of Satan as a tyrant, of Satan as a slave driver. Satan enslaves mankind to sin Much like Pharaoh enslaved the children of Israel in Egypt, Satan has enslaved mankind to sin. John 8:34, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin." And Paul says in 2 Timothy 2, "God may perhaps grant them repentance leading to a knowledge of the truth, and they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will." Satan enslaves mankind to sin. As we go through this and as we hear Pharaoh come up again in this story, the parallel that I want to draw is this parallel to the way that Satan has enslaved humanity through the fall to his tyranny, his rule, his power. And we'll see how this plays out a little bit later in the following chapters. Secondly, Satan wants to destroy God's creation. He wants to destroy God's creation. You saw Pharaoh go from just merely slavery to escalating it all the way to the killing of the Hebrew baby boys. And I think in the same way, sin in our own lives, when sin gets a hold of us, when we start to engage sin, it often starts off in small ways, but it escalates, it grows until it goes from merely small sin in our minds to death. James says that sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. Paul says in Romans, the wages of sin is death. We see the same idea here in the story of Pharaoh. Peter says in 1 Peter, "Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." Satan wants to destroy God's creation, and he's in that process. So that's where we're going to end today in the end of chapter 1. And it's a cliffhanger, and that doesn't feel good at all. The reality is that we're at the bottom of the story here. It couldn't look any bleaker than it does right now for the children of Israel. They're enslaved. They're losing their sons. And like the Hebrews, like these Hebrew slaves in Egypt, in the same way spiritually, I think we're left longing and waiting for someone to deliver us. Someone to deliver us from the bondage of Pharaoh. And the reality is that today, our world is longing for delivery from the bondage of Satan. Satan has this world in his bondage, in the chains of his lies, in the chains of sin, and our world is longing for relief from that. And many of you know what it's like to be in the bondage of Satan, to be under Pharaoh's stick, be under his tyranny, his rule. And you know what life is like living Pharaoh's system. You know what it's like to live Pharaoh's system, being enslaved, being in bondage. And some of you know what it's like to see that grow and progress and escalate until it takes you to a place where you would rather die than live. The reality is that as a people, this world is longing for relief from this system of Satan's tyranny. The reality is that there's only one who can save us from that. There's only one who can save us from the tyranny of Pharaoh, the tyranny of Satan. And we'll see that the birth of a deliverer, the story of Moses coming, being born in the next chapter, to rise up and lead his people out of Egypt. Much like a parallel of how Jesus came to deliver us from the yoke of sin and in slavery to Pharaoh, to Satan. Isaiah 61:1 is a prophecy concerning Jesus, and later Jesus actually quotes this. "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners. Our world is looking for relief from Pharaoh's ways, from Pharaoh's system, from the bondage that is Satan's way. At the closing of the speech that I read at the introduction, Frederick Douglass, his speech, he here again talking about American slavery. He closes with a poem by William Lloyd Garrison. And while this is talking about American slavery, the slavery of the African Americans in America, I think there's some interesting parallels here that paint a picture of what life is like under Satan's rule. God speed the year of Jubilee, the wide world o'er, when from their galling chains set free, the oppressed shall vilely bend the knee and wear the yoke of tyranny like brutes no more. That year will come and freedom's reign to man his plundered rights again restore. God speed the hour, the glorious hour, when none on earth shall exercise a lordly power, nor in a tyrant's presence cower, but all to manhood's stature tower by equal birth. The hour will come to each, to all, and from his prison house the thrall go forth. Satan is a tyrant that wants to destroy God's creation. And many of you know what it's like to be freed from that through the deliverer Jesus, through the Savior Jesus. There might be some of you here today who are in chains and who are in bondage and who are living under Satan's power. And there's only one who can save you, and that's Jesus. There's only one who can free you, who can break those chains, who can break those chains of sin. In closing, I'm going to ask Sean, if you come forward, if you could lead Veiled in Darkness, Jubilee. I think it paints it's a Christmas song, but it paints a picture of the way that this chapter 1 ends, of the children of Israel looking forward to a deliverer, someone to deliver them, to bring freedom, to break their chains. And I think it paints such a beautiful picture of how all of creation and humanity was looking for a Savior, looking for a deliverer. And we'll close with that song then. That's okay.